Good morning, and welcome to the First Baptist Church of Dunn Sunday School lesson. I'm Larry Snipes bringing the lesson this morning. This morning we're going to talk about Hannah and Eli. Sometimes we need to work through misunderstandings to arrive at fulfilling the role God has in store for us. Leslie Weatherford, pastor of the Simple Temple in London for 24 years, was a prolific author known best for his book, The Will of God, an accumulation of 5 sermons he preached during the disastrous days of World War II. Weatherford authored other books as well, including an intriguing volume called Private House of Prayer. He identified 7 rooms in this house of prayer. Room 1 is a room in which we affirm the presence of God. Room 2 is a room in which we praise, thank, and adore God. Room 3 is the room of confession, forgiveness, and unloading. Room 4 is the room set aside for the affirmation and reception. Room 5 is a place for purified desires and sincere petition. Room 6 is the room of intercession for others. Room 7, which he calls the big room at the top of the house, is set aside for medications. All of the rooms are essential to a full experience of prayer. However, the room we probably most often visit is room 5, the room in which we place our desires and petitions before God. Of course, we can overemphasize the importance of this room. When one mother asked her son if he prayed before going to bed the night before, he answered, "No, I didn't really need anything." Nevertheless, prayer does include the presentation of our petitions to the Lord. At the heart of the Lord's Prayer, Jesus instructs us to include this petition: "Give us this day our daily bread." Jesus tells us, "Ask and it will be given you." In our text for this lesson, we will study one of the most consequential petitions in the Old Testament. Many of us are familiar with the hymn, Sweet Hour of Prayer. The song reminds us of the privilege of praying to God at all seasons, and circumstances of life. I tried to be in a constant state of anxiousness. Even in retirement, I have demands on my time that are hard to deal with. I have found the time I spend in prayer gives me a clearer vision for my life. This week's scripture passage tells us about Hannah, who prayed to God during an especially stressful time when she struggled with disappointment and frustration. Hannah's story demonstrates the comfort and help we find in going to God in prayer. How has prayer helped you in difficult times? Hannah's story also shows us how other people can misunderstand our situations. It is good if they can develop better understandings, but it's better to know that God always understands. This week's lesson test tells us about 2 conversations. The first conversation is between God and a woman named Hannah. The second is between Hannah and a priest named Eli. Both conversations occur because Hannah is trying to cope with disappointment and despair. Our first set of scriptures is entitled Praying in Troubled Times. It comes from 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. After they had eaten and drank at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat beside the doorsteps of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made this vow: "O Lord of hosts, if you will only look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servants, but will give to your servant a male child, then I will set him before you as a Nazarite until the day of his death. He shall drink neither wine nor intoxications or no razor shall touch his head. We see in 1 Samuel provides the background for our lesson text. We're first introduced to a man named Elkanah, who had two wives named Hannah and Peninnah. Hannah doesn't have any children, but Peninnah does. In the social culture context of ancient Israel, producing a male heir was crucial from the perspective of both husband and wife. The husband needed a male heir to perpetuate his name, and an inheritance in the wife's personal and social standing depend highly on her providing a male heir. Given the importance of assigned to the producing a male heir, Elkanah may have married Peninnah after Hannah was unable to have a child. Important biblical women, including Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, dealt with infertility before finally giving birth. The book opens and the biblical writer focuses on the spotlight of a family who lived in the period when the judges ruled over Israel. Elkanah is the father of the family. We don't know his vocation, but he clearly demonstrates his devotion to God by his regular pilgrimages to Shiloh to offer sacrifices, and by his response to Hannah when she tells him she plans to dedicate their son Samuel to the work of the Lord. Elkanah replies to Hannah's announcements, saying, "Do what you seem best to you." And then he adds, "Only may the Lord establish his word." The biblical writer hints at the coming trouble when he reveals that Elkanah had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Although never sanctioned by God, some of the Hebrews resorted to bigamy if the first wife was unable to have children. Abraham added Hagar as a wife when Sarah could not produce a child, and Jacob added Bilhah as a wife when Rachel could not produce a child. Elkanah's wives do not get along. The conflict grows out of contrast between Hannah's infertility and Peninnah's fertility. Elkanah's obvious favor towards Hannah exacerbates tension between the two women. Peninnah further stirs the pot by constantly demeaning Hannah because of her infidelity. Hannah does not react openly to Peninnah's taunts. Instead, she silently addresses the issue with God. On their annual trip to Shiloh to make sacrifices to God, Hannah once more seeks solace for her situation. The biblical writer tells us, after they had eaten and drank at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. At this point, we meet another player in the story unfolding in our text, Eli. He's the priest at Shiloh. The worship center where Hannah prays is the tabernacle that resides in Shiloh during that time. The biblical writer gives us somewhat of a contradictory portrait of Eli. On one hand, Eli will play a significant role in the call and nurturing of Samuel, one of the most prominent characters in Israel history, the man who bridges the transition from the rule of the judges to the establishment of Israel's monarchy. On the other hand, he exercises no control over his delinquent sons, Hophni and Phinehas, when their outrageous behavior elicits deep disgust from the people of Israel, and when their conduct corrupts the services of the tabernacle at Shiloh. Eli only mildly reprimanded them. Consequently, they ignored his admonistration and continued their own obvious behavior. In our text, we see a good side of Eli as he encourages Hannah in her pursuit for a son. When accompanying her husband on another trip to Shiloh for the annual sacrifice, Hannah takes the opportunity to petition God for his son. Our text informs us that Hannah presented herself before the Lord. Notice the passion which Hannah prays. The writer says she was deeply distressed. We see the same word for distress used of Esau when he recognized that Jacob had stolen his birthright. The word describes someone in deep anguish. Hannah also wept bitterly. The word for this praise describes someone whose body is shaken and sobs as she continues her prayer to God. The experience of prayer erupts from a passion that engulfs Hannah's whole being. In her prayer, she makes a bargain with God. The object of her prayer is very clear. She asks God to give her a male child who carry on the name of her husband, Elkanah. Because she sees her barrenness as a curse from God, she asks God to remove the curse and allow her to become pregnant. She wants to please her husband. She asks God for a male boy or male baby. In return for God's favor, she promises that her son will be a Nazirite until the day of his death. A Nazirite's vow was temporary, as when Paul ended a temporary vow in Corinth. In other cases, the vow involved a lifelong commitment. We see with Samson, John the Baptist, and Samuel. Outward signs of this Nazirite vow included uncut hair, abstention from wine, and avoidance of contact with the dead. Hannah praises God that if God grants her request and gives her a son, she will relinquish his son for lifelong service to God. A second set of scriptures is entitled Hannah and Eli. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth and lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." But Hannah answered, "No, my Lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation of all times." Then Eli answered, "Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petitions you have made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your sight." Then the woman went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husbands, and her countenance was no longer sad. Unbeknown to Hannah, Eli is observing her passionate praying. He doesn't hear her prayer, either because she does not want others to hear her talk about her barrenness, or because she does not want to disturb others who are there to pray. She prays silently. However, Eli sees the emotional agitation reflected in her body movements, and he sees her lips moving as she is babbling incoherently. Consequently, he assumes she's drunk. Instead of offering his help, he admonishes her for dishonoring the worship center with her drunken display. This provides for the context for the conversation that follows, which corrects his misunderstanding of her intentions. Eli reprimands Hannah for what he thinks is her disrespect for the tabernacle, for her drunken conditions. Hannah attempts to correct this erroneous conclusion. She assures Eli that she is not drunk. In fact, she explains that she has drunk nothing at all. Instead, she reveals her emotional turmoil. She is indeed deeply troubled. However, she does not respond to her inner turmoil by turning to wine. Instead, she responds by turning to God. She does not pour wine to her body. Instead, she pours her soul out to God. Hannah hopes that this clarification of her condition and her motives will entice Eli to change his opinion of her. Eli's abrupt change from condemning her drunkenness in the house of worship to promising that God will grant her petitions suggests we don't have the entire conversation between Eli and Hannah in our text. Does he promise that her prayer will be answered based simply on the passion of her petition to God? More likely, in further conversation, she explains to him the basis for her passion and the promise she has made to God. Unfortunately, the biblical writer does not include the full conversation in our text. What we do know is that following our conversation with Eli, their conversation with Eli affirms that her prayer will be answered. Our text thus presents Hannah in a prime example of truth. James later offers in his epistle, the prayer of the righteousness is powerful and effective. With humility, Hannah accepts Eli's promise. She says, "Let your servant find favor in your sight." She returns to her quarters and reunites with Elkanah. Notice the change in her. No longer is she troubled. Tranquility replaces her inner turmoil. She lays her concern before God and leaves it there. The writer illustrates her return to normalcy as she calmly sits down for a meal with her husbands as they worship in God's tabernacle at Shiloh. And our last set of scriptures is 1 Samuel 1:19 through 20. They rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord. Then they went back to the house at Ramoth. Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. In due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, "I have asked him of the Lord." The story ends on a happy note. Hannah and her husband share a sexual encounter. The use of common biblical language, Elkanah knew his wife Hannah. She conceives and gives birth to a son, whom she names Samuel. When she weans him, Hannah keeps her promise and gives him to Eli to be transferred for a lifetime of service to God. Samuel serves as the last judge over Israel. He anoints the first king of Israel as the nation moves from the rule of judges to a monarchy. He continues all his life as a judge over and a prophet to Israel. And after God turns from Saul, Samuel will anoint David as the new king of Israel. During his lifetime, no other individual plays such an important role in the nation of Israel as Samuel does. The conversation between Hannah and Eli in the sanctuary at Shiloh does indeed have far-reaching consequences. What lessons can we learn from this encounter between Hannah and Eli? First, Hannah shows that the proper response when we are troubled by something is to turn to God in prayer. She did not turn to wine or to some other temporary stimulant. She did not turn to her friends. Instead, she lays out her problems before the Lord and seeks God's help. She follows the advice Paul later gives to the Philippians. Do not worry about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. Hannah also illustrates the importance of following through on our commitments. She promises to do something before God answers her prayers. She fulfills her promise. After God answers her prayers, she does what she promises to do. Her actions contrast with the commitment Simon Peter makes to Jesus on their last night together, when Jesus tells his disciples they will all forsake him. Peter responds, "Though all become deserters because of you, I will never desert you." Yet later, when a woman accuses him of being one of Jesus' followers, he retorts, "Woman, I do not know him." What an impressive example Hannah sets for us. Finally, Hannah reminds us that sometimes God's service to God involves sacrifice. We do not know how long Hannah puts up with Penna's taunting over her barrenness, but it is apparently several years since Peninnah gives birth to more than one child. Then when God finally gives Hannah the son she so desperately longs for, she takes him to Eli at the temple and leads him there for a life of service. She seldom gets to spend time with him and cannot build a relationship with him, yet she willingly makes that sacrifice to express her faith and gratitude in God. As we see, we're studying the book of Samuel today, and Hannah is Samuel's mother, and Samuel is one of the great prophets that we see and have already talked about in this book. The story of Hannah and Eli reminds us of the importance of prayer. We all go through struggles that can cause us an anguish and break our hearts. Hannah demonstrates the value of expressing our deepest concerns to God. The conversation between Hannah and Eli reminds us not to jump to conclusions about someone else's circumstances and experiences. Eli may have encountered drunken revelers in Shiloh, but he shouldn't have made the assumption about Hannah or anyone else based on past experience. Once he has listened to Hannah and took her seriously, he learned of her sincere struggle. Sometimes someone needs to listen to them. Sometimes someone needs to hear an encouraging word from us. But before we can help, we must listen. And as we close today, our closing prayer, O God, thank you for hearing our prayers. Help us be honest with you about what we are going through. Help us trust that you are working your purposes out. Also help us grow in understanding as we listen to each other with compassionate concern. Amen. Thank you for tuning in to the First Baptist Church Sunday School lesson in Dunn, North Carolina.